And then the first movie that I had was sort of put on as a creative executive was, at that time, it was called American Bullshit, but what ended up becoming American Hustle. I think still to this day considered the most profitable movie in history. I don't think anyone really cares in Hollywood where you went to film school. They just sort of, want to know that you went somewhere, which is absolutely the truth. I had to know those things. I had to know those things as well as the people that are responsible for doing those jobs.
Our movie theater releases, is that sustainable long term?
Nobody was calling me. I couldn't even get an interview or a job offer. I was getting nothing, and I was starting to panic. And I just lied, and I said yes to everything. I just said, yes, I could do that, and I've done that, and of course I know how to do that, because I knew that if I got this job, I'll figure this stuff out. That was like my grad school. That was like me, being literally on the front lines of the making of The Dark Knight, on every little piece and every little thing that was happening and why it was happening. You're taking over starting today. And I've never only had one assistant in my career. I don't know how you're going to do it. I'm leaving tomorrow for London. It was a crash course on how to make movies at the highest level. And then I did Suicide Squad, which was a big part of my life for a few years. That's not a smart decision, in my opinion. If you're going to start financing movies, you should finance 5 movies. That movie cost $175 million to make.
On this episode of Boundary Breakers, we sit down with Andy Horwitz. Andy is one of Hollywood's most successful movie producers and has been involved in producing 5 of the highest grossing movies of all time, including American Hustle, Oppenheimer, Suicide Squad, and Dark Knight. And Andy shares some amazing Hollywood insight with us, including what it takes to make a Hollywood hit movie and why the best movies aren't always the highest grossing movies. Andy also shares with us how he's built his brand new company, which is disrupting the way that movies are produced in Hollywood going forward. So stay tuned and watch. I think you're going to love this episode. Boundary Breakers is brought to you by Carter & Clark. I've been looking forward to this one for several weeks, man, and I appreciate you taking some time to do this.
Happy to.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
So what I'd love to do is I'd love to just start out briefly, which is, kind of your origin story. How did you get started in the film industry? What motivated you to get there? Uh-huh. And then we could talk about, some of your experience and some of your wins of which you've had a lot. And then, I kind of want to dig a little bit into your thought process about, what makes a great producer in your case, and also sort of like what makes a great hit, right? Like, that's what we're really trying to tease out in all of this is what separates the extraordinary from, the regular. And then we'll conclude with just some more couple of sort of off-topic questions. But if that sounds good to you, we can rock and roll.
Let's do it. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Awesome. So just tell us a little bit, just, for context's sake, where you grew up and how you found yourself in the film industry.
I grew up in Los Angeles. It's weird to say that in Hollywood to people because most people that work in Hollywood didn't grow up in Hollywood. They all sort of came here. They're transplants here. So whenever I meet somebody that also grew up here, it's almost like we just were like, oh, here we are. It's you too. It's just like it's a rare thing. I'm telling you, most of the people that I work with in the business that run the studios, the agencies, writers, directors, other producers, they didn't grow up in LA. They kind of came here. So I grew up in LA. I grew up in this sort of suburb of LA called Agora Hills, which is about 45 minutes outside of Los Angeles. And I grew up in a entertainment business family. So, but very different sides of the entertainment business than I've ever worked in. So like, for example, my grandfather was a banker who in the 70s decided that there is a new and interesting way to finance movies. And he was one of the architects of something that we still use today, which we call the foreign sales model, which foreign sales model essentially means that you are loaning money for movies and you're loaning money against foreign pre-sales. So you're essentially mitigating most of your risk. So let's say, for example, like your budget is $2 million and you can now take a movie all around the world to France, Italy, Japan, Latin America, and you essentially pre-sell that movie. So distributors will spend money before you even make the movie, and then you use that money to essentially pay back your loan that you've taken to make the movie. And so
Oh, wow.
you're the entity that's loaning the money is taking very little risk as long as they have good relationships with these distributors all over the world and they know that they're going to pay on time
Yeah.
and so what my grandfather did was he started doing that a few times at the bank that he was working for, and it was working out so well that they actually gave him then started his own company with a direct relationship with that bank. So it was sort of one step removed from that bank, but he was using their money. And so he was that's he financed that way a lot of movies, hundreds of movies that way, most of which you've never heard of. They're very, very small. A few that you have, and a very famous one for him, two famous ones actually, one of which was My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which
Oh,
was
yeah.
it was a super what I think still to this day considered the most profitable movie in history of Hollywood, considering that it cost I think 2.5 or $3 million to make, and I think grossed, I don't know, over 300 million, 400 million, somewhere in there. In that
Wow.
version, he was a banker loaning money for that movie. So you don't get a piece of the back end. You just get your money and your vig back, and then that's kind of it. So that was a famous one that he did. He did one called Monster, which was Charlize Theron won the Oscar for that one about
Yeah.
15 years ago. Patty Jenkins, one of her first movies. So he was very entrenched in that side of the business. But it was when I started in Hollywood, or at least when I was a kid, even I knew that wasn't the kind of movies that I wanted to make. I didn't really want to make movies just for the sake of making movies, and I wanted to make movies that people were going to remember and that people were going to see and that were for a wide commercial audience, not for sort of this very small indie market. And back then, DVD was huge, and so like the direct to DVD market was just people were making a fortune hand over fist financing movies this way and then selling the DVDs and just making a lot of money. And so when I was a kid, he would always I would see some of the stuff he was working on, and I kind of grew up in and around that. We went to the American film market when I was a kid all the time. And then my dad he works on the physical production side of the business. So that means like the nuts and bolts of physically making things, purely non-creative side of the business. And was one of the first shows that he was a producer on was Unsolved Mysteries. And Unsolved
Oh,
Mysteries
wow.
was a really big hit back then, and a show that I loved as a kid. I actually was in a few of those episodes, and I got to like be around when they were shooting it. And they shot a lot of it in LA, and they did the reenactments in LA, and so I was like sometimes an actor in the reenactments. And so
Oh,
that
that's
was
cool.
yeah. And so then the reality TV business started pretty significantly in the early mid 90s, and then he transitioned to that side of the business, and now he runs production for The Talk, which is on CBS. It's sort of like The View, but it's CBS version of The Talk. And so again, that's a very specific side of the business as well, the entertainment business. Also a side that I knew I didn't want to be involved in that side of the business. And so like I said, when I was a kid, I grew up in and around it. And then when I graduated high school, I wanted to go to film school, but I also grew up my whole life surfing and skateboarding and snowboarding. And so if I was going to go to film school, I wanted it to be a film school that I was, not more than 5 minutes away from the beach, essentially, is the way I sort of looked at it.
Love it.
My brother at the time, who was also a screenwriter, he's only 14 months older than me, so we sort of grew up together. He's a screenwriter. At that time, he was going to USC Film School, and he sort of convinced me not to go to USC Film School. He said, "Listen, like, it is great for what it is, but it's $40,000 a year, and I don't think anyone really cares in Hollywood where you went to film school. They just sort of want to know that you went somewhere," which is absolutely the truth. So I said, "Great." So I went to this little private art school called the Brooks Institute of Photography that was based up in Santa Barbara, and
Nice.
I had a really really lovely time being there. And for me, anyways, it was a film school that I loved because it was a 3 year program. It was year round. So we got our Bachelor of Arts degrees in 3 years as opposed to 4 years. And it gave me the opportunity to just make a lot of stuff. And so what I did when I was in film school is I took all the classes. So I took directing and editing and cinematography and screenwriting because I knew in order to be a good producer, which I always wanted to be, I had to know those things. I had to know those things as well as the people that are responsible for doing those jobs because On a movie set, I'm their boss, which means that I'm the one that's responsible for telling them what their budgets are, what they can and can't do, what they're and then of course every time I do that on movies, they're coming back to me explaining to me why they need certain things and they need to spend so much money and yada yada. If I don't understand what their jobs are to us, then how am I supposed to have those arguments? They're just going to run circles around me. So I knew that early on that I had
Got
to
it.
learn those things. So I learned all of those things, and I just produced everybody's movies. So I produced, I did three thesis films at one time,
Oh my
and
gosh.
so it was amazing. And one of those thesis films got into Sundance, and I was like, I thought to myself, I was 22 years old or 21 years old, and I had produced a short film in Sundance. In retrospect, that means absolutely nothing really as a producer. I mean, it's cool, but it's like it's not going to no one's going to give me a movie to produce because I did a short film that was at Sundance. And so, but of course, I didn't know that, and I had a chip on my shoulder, and I graduated film school, waltzed, moved back down to Hollywood, and expected my phone to be ringing off the hook, that everyone was going to be calling me to produce their movies, and I was like God's gift to producers. And I'm this young 23-year-old kid who just like waltzed into town, and my phone's going to be nonstop. And of course, it was completely the opposite. Could not have been further from the truth in terms of what actually happened, which was nobody was calling me. I couldn't even get an interview or a job offer. I was getting nothing, and I was starting to panic. And I was like 3 months into living in LA again, and I remember a friend of mine had told me when I was in film school that the best way to get a job is like you're going to need to know somebody that's going to give them your resume for you, because like there's no one that gets hired in Hollywood because they sent a random resume to an email address on a job list. It's just there's too many people that want to be in this business for anyone to hire someone that way, which means the only way that
Right.
people are getting hired are the people that know somebody that knows somebody. That's really the only way to do it. And now, that's the only way I hire people. I'm never going to hire. I need There needs to be some accountability for who I
Right.
hire, meaning that I need to be able to, if it doesn't work out and it goes poorly, there should be someone that I can call going, hey man, like what was that about? Like, why did you send me that
Yeah.
person? And so, that's how Hollywood works. It's very much how Hollywood has always been. And so I called up a friend of mine who I went to high school with, who was an assistant to a director named Pete Siegel, who was a very successful director at the time. And at that time, he was about to start directing Get Smart, which was being made at Warner Brothers, the one with Steve Carell and Anne Hathaway. And he said,
Yeah.
"Hey, our producer on Get Smart I think he's hiring a second assistant, and his name is Charles Roven, and you should look him up. He's a big deal." And so, of course, like I knew who he was just because I knew who all the producers were. And I said, "Sure, give them my resume." And so they did. So they gave them my resume, and I was it was the very first interview that I got out of film school was at a company called Atlas Entertainment as the second assistant for Chuck Roven. And so
Okay.
I remember, and this is early 2007, and I remember sitting in that office, and like Entourage was kind of a very big show at the time, and I remember thinking like, oh my god, I'm on the set of Entourage. It's this like high
Yeah.
rise building with this amazing view, and the offices are insane, and people are running around like crazy. And I'm sitting in there, and I'm wearing a shirt like this, which is just sort of a button down short sleeve shirt. And there's two other guys sitting in the lobby with me, and they've got suits on, and they've got like briefcases. And I remember looking at them going, should I have a suit on? Is that what you're, should I be wearing a suit? And they looked a lot older than me too. They were probably 5 or 6 years older than me. And I think at that moment I convinced myself I'm not getting this job because like, look at these guys. They're wearing suits and I'm wearing
Yeah.
this. And that's kind of what was going on in my head. And I convinced myself I wasn't going to get the job. And then which is why I think I did so well in that meeting, because I was so comfortable
Uh,
thinking that like, you're not going to get this. So just like relax, just go for it, be
yeah.
yourself. And in that meeting, there's lots of things that they asked me, could you do or have you done? And I just, lied. And I said yes to everything. I just said, yes, I could do that. And I've done that. And of course I know how to do that because I knew that if I got this job, I'll figure this stuff out. Like I'm smart enough. I've
Yeah.
got enough resources. I'm smart enough to be able to figure out how to do assistant level stuff. And so yeah, so I had that meeting. I went home. I'm like, okay, great. I got one meeting in. That means like the next one's going to be easier. And then 2 weeks later, they called me and they said, hey, we really liked you, and we want you to meet Chuck, and he's coming into town. At that point, he was in soft prep on The Dark Knight, in soft prep on Get Smart. We were in post production on this movie called The Bank Job. There was a lot going on at one time at the company. It was the busiest he had ever been, and so I remember going to, the only time he had time to meet me was like on a Sunday night at like 9 o'clock at night, at his house. And he had just gotten back from like scouting in London, and he was so exhausted. He did not want to be having this meeting. He didn't want to have to be looking for a new assistant. And he spent the next like 45 minutes trying to convince me why I didn't want this job, and that
Really?
it was going to be so difficult for me. And he was so demanding, and he screams and he yells, and, all those kinds of things. And I loved everything I was hearing. I'm like, listen, like I'm 23 years old. I don't have a girlfriend. I don't have a partner. Like this is a point in my life where I can literally put every single thing that I have into this. There's nothing else that's distracting me in my life right now. And I think he loved hearing that. And it was very surprising that he would hire me as a second assistant with no true assistant experience, because usually those kind of jobs go to like agency assistants that were like at an agency, and now they're coming out of an agency. And so for me, the only experience that I had was I had done a lot of production assistant work when I was in film school. I would drive down to LA on the weekends, and I would PA on music videos and reality TV shows and independent films, and, a day here, a day there. And so I had a lot of that on-set experience, but not like in an office experience. But the job that I had coming into there, that I was like my full-time job in film school, was that I managed the video store in Ventura, California, which was like the local video store.
Oh,
And
nice.
and I loved managing that video store. I had such a good time. And the video store was owned by this like little stoner hippie. And I remember
Yeah.
when he called me and said he wanted to hire me, but my hiring was contingent on a good reference coming from my previous job, which was the video store. I thought to
Oh,
myself, oh my God, Chuck Roven is going to be calling Sandy, my like stoner hippie, video store owner who's like never spoken to anyone, like this in her life. What is that
right.
phone call going to be like? And I remember calling Sandy and being like, listen, like you're going to get a call from this guy named Chuck Roven. He's a very big deal. I need you to like, don't screw this up for me. She's like, of course not. And so of course he called her, checked the reference, called me back, hired me. And so I started there.
Awesome.
I started there in March of 2007 as the second assistant, which was pretty much just like an intern, a little bit of a glorified intern, pretty much.
I love
And,
it. I love it.
and yeah, and so as the second assistant, you're really just filing papers and booking travel, and that's kind of it. You're not really doing much more than that. And the first assistant, who was sitting right next to me, is the one that really does all the heavy lifting. Manages his entire calendar, all of the stuff he does. And also assistants in Hollywood, not a lot of people know this, but assistants in Hollywood that work for people like that, they listen to every phone call that's happening in the office. So every phone call that Chuck Roven is having with directors, other producers, studio executives, agents, managers, lawyers, actors, the assistants are listening on the line the whole time. And the reason they do that
Wow.
is because there's so much happening so fast in real time that they need to listen, so they could essentially be sharing a brain with their boss and proactively do things without having to be asked to do things. So if you're hearing them on the phone and they're talking about, yes, we have to set a conference call so then we can be prepped for that meeting next week. The phone, they hang up the phone call's over. Your boss shouldn't ask you, I need you to reach out and set that conference call. You heard that happen. So you should just be doing that proactively. And
Gotcha.
that's why, and a lot of times, like when, you know, bosses, agents, studio executives, producers, they'll even start talking to their assistant like on the phone, because everyone knows the assistants are listening. Like everybody's aware of it.
Gotcha.
That's how it works in Hollywood. And so like
Wow.
every phone call that's made in Hollywood, that's to an agency, a studio executive, a producer, even with me, my assistant today, I have him listen to all my phone calls too. A, because it's a great learning experience for them to hear how this is being done, but B, it just gives you some comfortability knowing that like someone else is looking out for you. If you promise someone something or you told them you were going to do something, you've got an assistant that's like holding you accountable when you hang up and they're bugging you to do those things, and so it keeps you accountable. And so
Yeah.
So I got to listen to every word of every conversation that he was having with everything that he was doing at the highest level in Hollywood when I'm a 23-year-old kid. So for me, it was like that was like my grad school. That was like me.
Wow.
I mean, being literally on the front lines of the making of The Dark Knight on every little piece and every little thing that was happening and why it was happening and getting to watch it and listen to the whole thing being put together and then being made and then being released and all of that entire life cycle of that movie and other movies too, Get Smart and Bank Job, and we made this movie called The International with Clive Owen at the same time. So we did like 4 movies in 2 years that way. And I just learned so much. I realized that like there was no reason to even think about going to grad school because I was having my grad school in that office, and I was also getting experience and getting ahead in my career while doing it. There was a lot of friends of mine and people that I knew that would graduate undergrad with a film degree and then decide to go to like the Peter Stark producing program at USC for grad school or AFI or what it is for producing. And then what would happen to them is that they would get out of those programs, they would be $100,000 more in debt. And now they would be 2 years behind me because that's not how Hollywood works. You're not going to get a better job because you went to the grad school in Hollywood. You're still starting at the same place as any entry level person is going to start in Hollywood. And so
Gotcha.
that was happening a lot. And so I just, I was this young kid. I was just getting ahead really quickly. And then, 3 months after I started working there, I'm listening to, I'm on the phone and I'm on the phone when he's talking to the first assistant, and the relationship is not going well. My first assistant is just getting hammered all day long, just getting berated and hammered. And he was terrible at communicating with Chuck. It was the type of thing where like if you mess up, there's so much happening so quickly every day in that office that like Chuck doesn't want to hear excuses as to, well, I did this because that person told me to do this, and then I thought this was happening, and this is why I did that. It's like no, just say you messed up. It's not going to happen again. Move on with your day. But Derek, which was the first, he just couldn't do that. He just and these long conversations where Chuck would end up screaming at him, and then all of a sudden it boiled over, and I'd only been there for 3 months. And again, I'm sitting there watching this every day, going like, I don't want to be in that chair. I'm comfortable in my little second assistant cubby here. I don't want to be on the firing line right there. And so I'm listening to this, and 3 months in, Chuck fires him on the phone, and it says like, "Listen, I'm on my way to the office. I actually don't. I want you to be gone by the time I get there." And so he just
Oh
sort of
my
like
gosh.
put his stuff down and like packed up and left. And I'm just sitting there looking around going like, I guess it's just me now. And so, so Chuck comes into the office and he looks at me and he goes, I hope you've been paying attention because you're taking over starting today. And I've never only had one assistant in my career. I don't know how you're going to do it. I'm leaving tomorrow for London. Essentially, like, good luck. And so now all of a sudden, as a 23-year-old, found myself essentially not just helping him run all these movies, but running his whole like personal life as well, and his kids and his, he's got a ton of stuff happening outside the film business with his real estate empire, all this other stuff. And I'm now like at the center of all of it. And
Wow.
I'm also starting to realize that like the way his office is run is very antiquated. It's old. It's like outdated. And like the people that were running it before just never changed it because they were scared to. But now that he was gone and it was just me, I could just change everything. And as long as he didn't feel it or notice, what does he care? And so I like created a digital file system, and I we were connected to the phones like this, and so I
Yeah.
bought wireless headsets so we could be walking around the office and doing things while we're talking to people on the phone. And just like I just revamped the whole office, and I had to reconform it to make sense for one person instead of two. And so I was taking two people's jobs and conforming them into one person's job. And he at that point told me, listen, like, if you could do this, I will promote you at this company if you could last 2 years. But just know that no one's ever done this alone on the desk. And he had been making movies for 35 years up until that point. And I've never been this busy in my whole career. So like, good luck. And
Wow.
so I was in that office every single day from 8 o'clock in the morning until almost 10 o'clock at night. I ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner on that desk. mostly because I was making $500 a week before taxes, no overtime, and didn't have wasn't
Jeez.
making a lot of money. And so I was like eating all my meals in the office because food was there and was provided. I had two cell phones. But that kind of job wasn't the kind of job where like if I'm out at a bar with my friends on a Friday night and he calls, you can't just like look at the phone and go, oh, I'll call him back tomorrow. It's like you have to leave the bar, pick up the phone, deal with whatever you have to deal with. If you're in a movie on a Sunday and he calls, it's not I'll call back when the movie's over. It's like I have to leave the movie now and I have to go deal with something. And so that's what my life was like for 2 years. And I will say like I kind of loved it. Like it was hard and super stressful and really intense, but it was a crash course on how to make movies at the highest level, being taught being attached to the hip of a guy that was doing it at the highest level. And so I wrote it out for almost 2 years completely by myself. We got through all of production and release of The Dark Knight and Get Smart and The Bank Job and The International. And we're now sort of in the summer of 2009. And he asked me to go to breakfast one day. And I wasn't even clocking when it was or how long I had been there really. And he, because he has that kind of brain, reminded me when we were at breakfast, by the way, last week was 2 years that I told you that if you're still here, I'll promote you. And this breakfast is to tell you that I'm going to make you the company's first creative executive that they had at the time because they didn't have one.
Wow.
And the company at that time, there was only about 6 people. When I left last year, there was 26 people. So it had grown obviously. And so I became the company's first creative executive. And I remember like my first day in my own office, and I'm like sitting in my own office, and I've got a computer and I've got a phone, and I've got nobody telling me like what to do anymore. I just have to go do it. And
Wow.
it was amazing. And so I just started bringing in my own projects and developing my own stuff at the company. And then the first movie that I had was sort of put on as a creative executive was at that time it was called American Bullshit, but what ended up becoming American Hustle. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I got to be a part of that movie from when it was just an idea about making a movie about the ab scam scandal all the way through developing scripts with it and getting financing for it and putting our crazy cast together and then physically going off and making that movie. And again, Chuck Roven is the kind of guy that knew that he needed to mold me into a producer like him. And the only way to do that is by physically being thrown to the lions and like sending me off to just go like be responsible for the making of that movie, or one of the people responsible for the making of that movie. And at that time I
Yeah.
was just like a junior producer. And and the studio that was paying for the movie didn't want they were like, we're not paying for him to go. We don't, Chuck, we like hired you to go make the movie. And so Chuck said, screw it, like I'll pay for it. So Chuck paid for me. He paid for my travel and living for 5 months to be there making the movie because he knew that he needed me to learn how to do that. So then he was essentially investing in me. So then when I finished that movie or another movie after that, I can now just be his producing partner as opposed to someone working for him. And he can now send me off around the world to go make other movies for him, and that amount of money that it cost him to send me there for 5 months to be a part of that was like, he made it back, 1,000 times after I
Yeah.
finished that and we got to make movies together. So in retrospect, it was very smart of what he was doing, and he was building me into his producing partner. And so throughout the next bunch of years, I just climbed the ladder at the company from, creative executive to vice president to senior vice president to executive vice president until I just was sort of squished up against the ceiling of the company. And I'd made a lot of movies. I got all the experience that you could possibly need as a producer. I went from American Hustle, then I made some smaller independent films, and then I did Suicide Squad, which was a big part of my life for a few years. And then the last movie that I made there was a movie called Triple Frontier that we made for Netflix. And that was like, it was $100+ million movie that I was the only producer on it. And I finished that movie, came out in 2019. And I remember thinking like, okay, I'd now been at Atlas and working with Chuck for 14 years. And there has to come a time at some point where I've got to have to take a leap out of the nest. Like I could stay here for another 10 more years. Chuck is 75 now, but he's one of those kind of guys that will be doing it for another 20 years and he'll just never
Yeah.
stop. But I also knew him so well that I knew that he's never going to make anyone a true true financial partner of that company. There's not going to be any profit sharing. It's always going to be about him. And there are
Right.
times where like I would make these movies and leave my family and go off and be on set for a year and travel around the world. And these movies were extraordinarily successful, but I wasn't feeling any of the upside, the financial upside of that. I was getting a salary. And so like for my salary, which was not bad, not a bad salary, and I was getting a bonus at the end of the year, but you look at the numbers, and you look at like, okay, he may have just made $20 million on that movie. I made 75 grand. Like, okay, like that,
Yeah.
it starts to not make sense as I got older. And there's a certain point where you go, okay, at what point do I get to start feeling, my own success as opposed to working really hard and letting someone else kind of own that success because they are paying me a salary to work for them. And so I just sort of gotten to the point where I'm like, I know how I'm doing this on my own anyways. I'm just giving all of my money to somebody else and sort of giving a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
credit to somebody else. And I finished that movie in 2019 and then thought about maybe 2020 was the year. And then of course the pandemic started. And that was very, very difficult on Hollywood for a number of reasons. And so decided, okay, not going to do that. And so I extended my contract till the end of 2021. He was trying to convince me to sign for 3 more years. We got in a big argument about it because he couldn't understand why I only wanted to do 1 year. And I said, listen, I just want to do 1 year. I don't want to sell myself short. Let's just do a year and then we'll figure out what the following years are going to be after that. And then I started 2021 and I knew from the beginning, like, this is your last year. Do not get comfortable. Save your money. Put your mindset you're going to go do this on your own. This is it. Like, don't bring in new projects you're going to feel invested in that's going to make you want to stay. And
Yeah.
so then I got to the end of 2021 and Chuck came back to me and he said, listen, I need you to, we're not doing another 1 year deal. It's 3 years. I need you to sign for 3 more years. And so I really like did some soul searching and I really thought about it. And of course I talked to my wife and I'm like, what do we think? And I just like every version of me signing that deal was really just delaying the inevitable by 3 more years is kind of how I kept coming back to. Inevitably, I'm going to leave. I didn't get into this business to have a boss my whole life. I don't need a boss. I know how to do this. I know the right decisions to make. And so I just decided, I'm like, this is it. And I went to him and we had a long conversation and he was a really good sport about it. He sort of was like, I knew this day was coming at some point. I knew you were kind of out. He felt that I was outgrowing the model in that company. And so yeah, so at the beginning of last year, I took the flying headfirst leap out of that really comfortable nest that I was in forever and started putting a new model together of how I felt like a production company should be financed and should exist in the current version of Hollywood as opposed to the version of Hollywood that's kind of existed for so many years because the business has changed so much in the last 3 years. Companies like Atlas and other bigger production companies that have existed for a long time, they've been operating on the same model for, 100 years. The production company model hasn't changed, but the business has changed so much around it that I thought, like, why not start a company that I feel like is very well suited for where Hollywood is going, as opposed to trying to conform the old model to where Hollywood is going. Because at a company like
Gotcha.
Atlas and all these other bigger companies, trying to get them to change their model, I would compare it to like trying to turn a cruise ship. It's like eventually you'll get there, but it's going to happen so slowly that by the time you
Yeah.
get there, the business is going to leave you behind. And
Yeah.
so that's what I did. So I put a new model together. I raised a little bit of money last year, and then I officially launched the new company, which is called Big Swell Entertainment, in October of last year.
Wow.
And yeah, it's been the best decision I've ever made. I absolutely love it. I've got some of my most favorite projects I've ever worked on. I currently have on my new slate right now that I'm developing and
Oh,
putting together. And it was a very difficult year to, year one really of the new company. Our 7 months of our year is gone because of this dual strike that happened. So that was not a fun
yeah.
experience to go through for
Mm.
year one, but we're teed up really well for 2024 next year. We've got a bunch of movies that I'm really excited about, and yeah, we're going to be off and running.
That is amazing. And I want to get into Big Swell and I want
Yeah,
to give you an opportunity to explain the model and how it's different and why it's different, and why you think it's going to be successful.
yeah,
For those of us that are, I guess, Hollywood outsiders, if you will, explain. I mean, you don't have to go to like into crazy detail, but look, we go to movies and we see executive producer, this person, or co-producers, executive director.
Yeah.
Can you generally explain the old Hollywood model in terms of who's financing this, where the upside's coming from, just so we're all on the same page?
Yeah, of course. When you're seeing all those credits on a movie, the word producer is the top level. So if it just says producer, that is the person that was physically responsible for producing the movie. Executive producer usually means that you had something to do with something, and so you have that credit.
Okay.
So it's weird to say that an executive producer is actually a lesser responsibility producer than the actual just producer. It's gotten even more specific over the past 10 years with now you're seeing these little letters called say PGA next to the producer credit sometimes.
Yep.
That is truly the person that really made the movie, because the producer credit is bastardized and thrown out like crazy. People are giving out producer credits because someone put 10 grand into a $5 million movie. You're getting this producer credit of some kind. Or maybe you had something to do with the rights, like you were a partner of the author that wrote the book and you're getting an executive producer credit just because. So those credits are given out like crazy. Almost
Okay.
all of those people, most of them, unless you see producer and then the words PGA, those people had very little to do with actually physically making the movie. They were a
Okay.
part of something that had to do it. But when it says just producer and then the words PGA next to it, that process to get that little PGA next to your name is a vetted process. It means that the producer guild is actually reaching out to people that were all over the movie and confirming that you in fact were responsible for the making of the movie. So they're asking your director, your studio executives, your first AD, your director of photography, your production designer, they're asking them, was he there every day? Did you report to him? Was he managing the movie? All of those things to make sure that you were actually there. And if all of that checks out, you get that little PGA mark right there. And so
Okay.
that's sort of how those. I mean, there's a bunch of different versions of those credits, but that's really its simplest form. Television is a whole separate thing. On television, the executive producer is the highest level. The
Okay.
regular producer is lower. So it's sort of swapped. But the model that existed, like I said, when the production company model that existed for so long, up until about 10 years ago, producers would get significant percentages of back end participation. So if a movie did extraordinarily well, you as a producer would do extraordinarily well.
Okay.
As the economics have changed at the studios and the streaming came into effect and the studios are hemorrhaging money, those producing deals are gone. That's a thing of the past. So that's like those, like guys like Chuck Roven who I worked with don't get those deals anymore either. And those used to be like wild deals. You used to like, back, let's say 10, 15 years ago, you used to get like 5% of the gross. It's what they call cash break even. So once the
Damn.
studios have made their money back, you then get 5% of the profits. And we were talking about having $1 billion movie. That's significant money on potentially just one movie that you made. And
Yeah.
so that's gone. And so there's still ways to get back end. It exists and people still do get it, but it's not at that level anymore. And in the streaming world, the way that the streaming world works is they essentially pre-buy your back end out from you. So you'll get a back end buyout from a streamer, which is about usually, if your movie would have come out in theaters and was marginally successful, you barely made your money back plus a little bit. That's kind of like what you would get as your buyout at a streamer. And so you're potentially leaving a lot of money on the table when you do a streaming movie because you're getting this little buyout. But you're also mitigating your risk because if your movie would have come out theatrically and lost money, you wouldn't see any back end at all. So at least you're getting something. And so that's how people legitimize doing that. But as a producer like myself, who's a very hands-on, very part of every part of the process and the nuts and bolts of making a movie, a studio knows that. And they're hiring me because they know that I'm going to be responsible for the movie as a whole, which means that like on a movie, I don't have any bosses on the movie except the studio or the financier. Those are the two bosses. Whoever's paying for the movie is who I work for that period of time making the movie. Outside of that, everyone else on the movie, actors, director, crew members, writers, they all report to me. So I only essentially have one person or one group of people to report to, and that's the studio or the financier. The studio or
Got
the
it.
financier, if they're paying me to produce a movie for them, they're going to require what we call exclusivity on that movie from what we call the start of prepping the movie until the movie wraps. On a big movie, that could be 7 or 8 months of a time period, which means that's most of your year, which then means if I'm only one individual and I'm the only producer at my company, it means I can only make one movie a year, if at most, maybe one and a half if I'm lucky. And that version, you can only make so much money if you're doing it that way. And these days, to be a successful producer, it has to be more of a volume based business. It means you have to have a bunch of movies going to try to make the same amount of money that people were making 10 or 15 years ago with making one movie. And so the
Got
only
it.
way to do that is by hiring multiple versions of me. So I have a few of us all working at Big Swell that allows us to make those other movies. Traditional production company model is usually just one key man with a bunch of executives that kind of help them get it done. And you can only do, so you're essentially topping out on what you can accomplish. Big Swell is formed very differently in a sense that we're going to have multiple producers. It's going to allow us to make multiple movies at a time. And again, when you're making movies, like, I always like to say, like, financing movies is like, it's like playing in Vegas, right? You're gambling pretty much. It's an educated gamble for sure in terms of who the elements are and who the producer is and do they have a successful track record. But at the end of the day, Hollywood in itself to make money is a volume based business. If you're a financier, you want to finance movies and you're going to put all your money into one movie, that's not a smart decision, in my opinion. If you're going to start financing movies, you should finance 5 movies because then
Yeah.
you just need one of the 5 to work and it's going to pay off the other 4 that didn't work. But
Gotcha.
so that's kind of like, I sort of took that mentality and applied it to a production company model that, they don't all have to be home runs. But if you hit a few singles and doubles and triples and you've got one home run, again, that's all you kind of really need for it to really make sense. So that's kind of how our company differentiates from the traditional production company model of the past.
Gotcha. So I guess to sort of put it into business, structure, would it be fair to say that either the studio or the financier, they're sort of the board of directors, right?
Yeah.
And then the producer would be the CEO. And then go ahead.
I think if you put it into, like, I have a lot of friends of mine that are in the real estate business, and I try to equate it to them. And the best way to describe it is the producer is like the general contractor. We're not the homeowners. We don't own the home, but we are responsible for hiring the workers and managing the budget and making sure that the job gets done on time and on budget and it looks good. And so that's kind of like, that's the best comparison I would say to, like, the film biz for what a producer does for movies. I think it's very similar to, like, what general contractors do. When I renovated my house, I remember, like, I was working with my general contractor and I'm like, we kind of doing the same thing. He was reporting to me because I'm the homeowner and I'm paying for it, but I'm not physically doing the work myself. That's very similar how the studio producer relationship works in Hollywood.
Got it. That's really helpful. And I think that's a great way to think about it. So do you have, there's so many questions that I'm just dying to ask you.
Yeah.
Are there certain directors that you just are your favorite that you just hope that you can get regardless of the project? Or is this like a matchmaking thing? Like these types of movies, you have a favorite director, but if it's a, horror movie or romantic comedy, you have these, how does that work in trying to get your subs?
It depends. There are, of course, probably 10 directors that it doesn't really matter what they're doing. I'm in, I'll sign up and produce their movie for them. Those are like the Chris Nolans of the world, the Tarantinos, the Spielbergs, the Scorseses, like the AAA level Hollywood director. And I work, David O. Russell, I think, who did American Hustle is near that level as well. And so, there, of course, like, there are those directors that, like, no matter what they've got going on, if they want me to produce a movie or if they want to direct a movie that I'm producing, it's just like, of course, like, there's not a question about it. And then on other stuff, you have to be very thoughtful in terms of, like, who you're going to hire as your director of your movie, because not all directors make sense for all movies. You have to make sure there's like what we call like a financeable director in Hollywood, and there's not that many of them. And those are people that have just done like a really good small movie that's like making some waves and people are talking about, and that I know because I have friends at all the studios that have told me, listen, if you could put this person on a movie, like we'll buy your movie. We just want to make a movie with this person. And so there's it that understanding who those people are requires someone to just be really in the know of what's happening behind the scenes of Hollywood and very well, uh, I call it well read, but really that means like you're watching everything. You're seeing all the new movies that are coming out. You're seeing who's doing a good job and who's doing a bad job. If you're thinking about hiring somebody, you're calling people that were either produced that movie for them or were a part of that movie and asking how were they? Were they assholes? Were they responsible? Did they deliver? Were they, what was the process like? So you're essentially checking off all these boxes of making sure that all these things are happening before you actually commit to hiring this director. And you want to make sure that whoever you bring on as a director is not going to be an anchor for your project, meaning that you're
Mm.
not going to be dragging an anchor along with you now. You're going to want to bring someone that's going to be additive to the process and someone that already going in because you're educated enough to make that decision that the studios are going to want to buy your movie or make your movie with that person directing your movie. And this is again all pre going to a studio. If your movie's already at a studio and they're looking to hire a director on a movie that you already have set up at a Warner Brothers or a Paramount, that process is a little bit different in terms of like I'll put a list together of directors that I like for it, that I think makes sense creatively, and that I know people are saying good things about in terms of how it was working with them. I'll send that list to my studio executive. I'll give them 20 names. I'll get an email back the next day with 7 names pulled off of that list. And then my response to them is like, okay, if I get one of these 7 people, our movie's a go, right? And then they say yes. And so then I'll go off and do my own thing. And I'll be talking to agents and figuring out availability and who's available when and who makes the most sense for it. And then eventually come back to the studio with one of those names that was on that list because I know that it's an
Cool.
approved name already, and I'll get it done at the studio.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, look, so when you were with Atlas, you worked on, I think, 4 of the top 100 most highest grossing movies of all time. And also,
It's actually 5
six,
now. We just cracked because the last movie that we made when I was there was Oppenheimer, so we just actually added another one to that
wow.
list of that I
All
I
right,
can now
well,
say
even better.
5. Yeah.
So 5 of the highest grossing movies of all time, and then you single-handedly produced Triple Frontier, great flick. So you know and have been involved intimately with mega hits, several of them.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you a question that I realize is an impossible question to answer, right? But what is it? What makes one of these mega hits? Is it impossible to predict? Is it everything just accidentally happens? You could never see it. Wait, help us outside of the bubble understand this.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 versions of it. Okay, so there's one version that if you have a great movie, obviously that's going for it. But all of those things, you're you're mitigating your risk from the beginning, which means you're hiring a director that you feel like is going to make a commercial version of that movie. You're not letting the movie get made until you have a great script. The cast that you cast in that movie, either they're about to have a movie that comes out that hasn't come out yet, you believe that movie is going to be a mega hit and it's going to make that person a star. Like for example, on Suicide Squad, that was Margot Robbie from Wolf of Wall Street. That was just come out, and so we had saw that, and we knew that she was going to be talked about, and so of course she made a great Harley Quinn, and so that was sort of like where we were coming from and putting her in as Harley Quinn. And so you have to all those things are happening before you even make your movie, before you even start making your movie. So you're essentially trying to mitigate your risk and make really well educated guesses that these are the right ingredients that are going to sort of churn out a hit. You don't ever really know, right, until you're like in the middle of it. And there are times I remember when we were making The Dark Knight, we were making American Hustle, where you just know this movie is going to be just a crush when it comes out. You could see it. You could feel it when you're making the movie. You just feel it. And then there are times you just are completely like, I don't fucking know if this is going to work. I hope this is going to work. I think this is going to work. We're not going to really know until we cut it together. And then you kind of just like hopeful that it's going to be a great movie. And so there's those 2 things. And then, you know, it's very different to describe. I think what made a hit, let's call it 10 years ago, and what makes a hit now. I think 10 years ago, and even less, I would say even like 8 or 9 years ago, you can churn out a hit and not have a good movie because you've done all of these things with marketing and P&A and publicity and all of these things that are going to get people to go. You know, Rotten Tomatoes is a thing that we hate in the business because like people are judging if they're going to leave their house to go see a movie just based on that percentage number now. They're not really even making decisions for themselves. They're sort of using other people's decisions. That's kind of annoying. But at the end of the day, it's like, when you have a movie like The Dark Knight, we knew from the beginning I remember seeing Heath Ledger for the first time in that makeup, and you're like, all right, this is going to be amazing. Like, you just knew.
Yeah.
And Chris Nolan, who directed, is like, you know, just an incredibly special individual, and there's just nobody like him in the business, and you just
Yeah.
knew what was happening, and we knew. But like, for example, like on Suicide Squad, that's a really good example of, like, I mean, in my opinion, I'm not like super proud of the actual movie itself, the creative vision of the movie and what the movie came out like, because it was lots of challenges that came along with making that movie. But as a producer, I knew what we had. I'd seen the movie. We were 7 months away from releasing the movie, and we all knew what we had, which was like not an amazing movie, but like a movie that I felt like we could still get people to come to. And
Yeah.
that movie cost $175 million to make. And when we realized what we had, I integrated myself deeply within the marketing department of Warner Brothers. And I knew that if we were going to be able to come up with like a creative, innovative marketing campaign, that's one, that we were going to get people to come. And that was creating these icons and the social media stuff that we did. And we did tattoo parlors, and we were everywhere. I mean, I was traveling everywhere doing all these stunts and crazy things. And then what we did, which was even smarter, was we created this insane soundtrack for the movie that was all of these really popular artists that were coming, and I was showing them early cuts of the movie. They were writing songs for like what was happening in the movie. And then what we did was we made 5 music videos with those artists. It was like Lil Wayne and 21 Pilots, and like these songs became such a big deal. The music videos that I was a part of, because I had to make sure they had our costumes and our makeup artists to this so they could do Jared Leto and make him look like the Joker. And we did all these music videos, and all of these music videos are getting millions of hits, and it's becoming a moment before this movie comes out where like there was so much buzz and so much anticipation, and we essentially made it bulletproof to lose money on the movie. It didn't matter if the movie was good or not. It was becoming a situation where if you're a normal person, you're going to go see it because you're going to want to know what the big deal, like what is this thing that I keep seeing everywhere. And Warner Brothers probably spent, I would say at least $150 million marketing that film as well, all over the world. And the movie was extraordinarily successful. We still, I think, to this day, have the biggest August opening of all time. We made $136 million in the opening weekend, and the movie topped out at $750 million. And we didn't even get a China release because it was the China censor board wouldn't allow our movie to be released there. And if we would have had a
Mm.
China release, that movie would have made $1 billion for something that is sitting at 27% on Rotten Tomatoes because of all of that heavy lifting that we did to get it there. And so, you know, these days now I think it's changed in a sense that it's really difficult to get people off their couch and into a movie theater because we have so many options at home to not have to do that. And the streaming world, in my opinion, is sort of been the worst thing for Hollywood that could have ever happened. But it was inevitable. Something had to happen, and it's really made it. There's a really specific delineation now between what I think is a streaming movie and what is a movie that should be played theatrically and can have and be successful theatrically. For me personally, I'm a traditionalist. All my goal for every movie that I make is I want it to be in a theater. I want to have that experience. It's part of what's so rewarding to me as a producer. You spend 2 years of your life working, 3 years of your life, 4 years of your life. I mean, American Hustle was 7 years it took us to get that movie made, and Triple Frontier was, I think, 8 years. And so, when you're spending that amount of years of your life making something, and all of a sudden it's just on a streaming service, and then it's like a flavor of the week, and it's gone tomorrow, it's like it stings a little bit. So when you're making a theatrical film, you're going to want to make sure that the movie that you're going to make, in my opinion, these days, it has to be loud, it has to be noisy, it has to be take a big swing, it has to be like people are going because they feel like they're missing out on something if they don't go, because all their friends are talking about it and they're seeing people tweet about it and Instagram post about it. And it has to be, you have to have that, what I call word of mouth marketing for a movie to be successful theatrically right now. And so that's not every movie. If you're a straight down the middle drama these days, like a straight down the middle drama, you're not, more than likely not going to make any money theatrically on your movie. You may make your money back and a little bit more, but it's really hard to get people to go out and see those movies in the theaters these days. So these days it's either an event movie of some kind, something based on a big piece of IP, or it's just a small little noisy movie that took a big swing and a big risk and it paid off. And everyone's calling their friends and going, "You got to go see this movie. I don't want to tell you anything about it. Just go see it. Don't read anything about it." Those are the kind of movies that are really working. Horror movies, genre movies, movies that have a fun theatrical experience where it's like you kind of have to watch it with an audience because it makes it better. Those are movies that are doing well in the theaters these days. And I don't see that going away. I think that theme is gonna probably stick around for a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was going to be my next question. Is
Yeah.
what do you think is sort of the future of theatrical release as it relates to I guess the streaming services? I mean, is it? And I hadn't thought about this question before asking it, frankly. But are movie theater releases, is that sustainable long term?
Yes, I think it is. I don't think the movie theater experience is ever going to go away, but I do think that there is a clear delineation now between a movie that is tailor made for a theater experience and one that is tailor made
Yeah,
for a straight to streaming release. And I think
gotcha.
there's two rules of thumb I think that you can look at today that
Okay.
I think exist. And one is this, is that if you see a movie, sound really mean to say this, but like it's true. If you see a film that's made by Warner Brothers or Amazon or Paramount and it has actors that you recognize in it, and you see that it's coming straight to Max or straight to Paramount Plus or straight to Amazon streaming service, more than likely it's not a great movie, because the decision to do that means that those studios knew, based on an educated guess, that if they try to release that movie theatrically, it's going to lose money. And usually it means that and so it's just mitigating the risk. They're just going to throw it on their streaming platform, because to release a movie the right way successfully is expensive. People don't realize that you can't just like make your movie for, let's say your budget's $20 million and then just release it. Because if you're making your movie for $20 million, the theaters, the exhibitors, are going to require from you a guaranteed marketing P&A spend that you're going to have to spend marketing for them to even agree to release your movie in the theaters.
Oh
Because
wow.
what if I'm an exhibitor? I'm not going to take up 6 screens, a week to put on a movie that my studio who's giving me the movie is not marketing, which means those theaters are going to be empty. And how's that going to help me? And so, if you have a movie that, let's say, costs $50 million, the rule of thumb essentially is your P&A marketing spend at a minimum is going to be $50 million. So you're essentially having to know that you're going to have to put all that extra money in to finance your P&A, your print and advertising and marketing, to get the right word of mouth out there, to get a true, these days a wide release is about 5,000 screens around the country. So to get that, you need to have serious money to spend. And if people make a movie and then all of a sudden you see something saying, "Oh, it's coming out straight to Max or straight to Amazon or straight to Paramount Plus," that usually means that they don't believe in that it's going to that it'll lose money, that it's going to cost them so much money to release it that they're never going to make their money back. So they're just saying, "We'll mitigate all that risk. We'll just throw it on there right now. We don't have to spend any marketing P&A money. It's going to help us for the service because people like it on the service, but like we don't believe it's going to work theatrically." And so, that's every streaming service except Netflix. Obviously, Netflix makes them just for streaming, so that rule doesn't really work for Netflix. But everywhere else, that's kind of the rule of thumb. And so yeah, there's a clear delineation, I think, these days in terms of what is going to make sense for theatrical and what's going to make sense for streaming. And usually, more often than not, those decisions are made before you even make your movie, because people could see what it
Wow.
is before it's made, and you'll usually be backing your way into either a theatrical version or a streaming version. The ones that are, quote unquote surprises, where you think it's going to be theatrical and then all of a sudden you find out it's going streaming, that just means they don't like the movie and they're not happy with it, and they're just going to decide, you know what, just dump it onto the streaming service, and we're going to move on.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, you said something really interesting a couple of minutes ago, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like, there's a difference between what is a commercial success in terms of being a hit,
Yeah.
and what is, a good piece of art, right? Or an actual good movie.
Yeah.
Particularly, and I think I heard you say sort of Rotten Tomatoes plays sort of an interesting role in sort of scoring things on that front. How does that feel from the Hollywood perspective? That's got to be a little bit frustrating that that those aren't exactly aligned, right? In other words, I would imagine if I'm producing movies or if I'm directing movies that I would want a hit to be equatable to a great movie, a great piece of art,
Yeah.
not the result of something else. Is that talked about in your circles, or?
Of course, yeah. I mean, you've every producer wants to win an Oscar, right? I mean, that's an art. Most movies that win Oscars, there are very few producers that ever get to win an Oscar ever, and so of course that's your goal. And there's the cross section of an Oscar-winning movie and a movie that was financially successful doesn't usually cross. Usually those are two separate things. And if you look at like most of the movies that are nominated for Oscars, almost all the ones that were nominated for Oscars last year, almost all of them, except Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I guarantee you, almost all of them that will be nominated for Oscars this year are movies that will more than likely have lost money, because that's
Gosh,
not. It's a crazy thing to say a lot. Except Oppenheimer, which I'm a little bit biased because it was an Atlas movie, but like that movie's
yeah,
close, about to make $1 billion, which is just insane for what that movie is. But um, most of those other movies that are going to be on there, when you look up the worldwide box office gross, the number is going to be pretty sad, especially comparatively to what they cost. And you have to, if you're setting out to make an art film and you're an investor, you should your mindset should be, I'm probably not going to make my money back. But some people, that's not the most important thing for them. They have an important story to tell that they want to tell, and or they want to make an awards movie. They want to rub shoulders at the Oscars and the Golden Globes and be on the red carpets and do all those things. And the money itself isn't necessarily the most important thing for them, because they can afford to lose it, or they can afford to just have that piece of business because they just want to be doing that. And a lot of people do that, and that's cool. If you want to do that, and a lot of studios do that. A lot of studios make movies because they know that that filmmaker has a track record of usually losing money on the movies that they make, but people love the movies. A specific audience loves the movie.
right,
So
yeah, okay, gotcha.
not necessarily a wide audience that's going to make it financially successful, but the hoity-toity art world loves that movie, and so
Yeah,
every studio is like the studios also want to win Oscars too, and it's just as important for them sometimes than making money. And so there's very rarely do you ever have an awardsy movie that is super financially successful these days. It used to happen a lot more, I think, 10 years ago. And every year there's a few, but I would say probably 90% of the movies that are nominated for Best Picture or that are getting nominated for all these awards at the Oscars now, if you actually looked at the books, it would be pretty ugly in terms of what the financials look like on those movies.
gotcha. Well,
Yeah.
so in terms of Big Swell, what's your hope or your vision for what you guys are going to do, and maybe 10 years from now where you'll be?
Yeah.
What when you're looking back?
Yeah. So Big Swell, when I raised money for Big Swell, we didn't raise. I pretty much raised enough money to give us like 2 years of runway, because I felt like that's what I really needed for us to start making money. Producers don't actually make money until we're physically making movies. So all of the stuff that comes before that, which is the developing, the packaging, the selling, the pushing the boulder up the hill, essentially, we're not making a single dollar throughout that entire period. So I looked at it as like, okay, in the first 2 years, I believe we'll start making money as a company, and that's okay. And so my goal with Big Swell is we're starting small. Right now, there's three of us, three producers, and the idea for Big Swell was born out of a very specific frustration that I had in the business, which is that the old guard is not going away. we're seeing the same. And I equate it to what's happening in politics as well. You know, with like you have some of these like senators and congressmen that are like 87 years old, and you're like, you're done. You
Yeah.
need to hand it
Enough
off
already.
to, yeah, you can hand it off to the next generation who now is very much more connected to the world we live in today, who's probably going to do a better job, but you just won't let go. Hollywood is very similar in terms of the studios are all run by this, the people that run the studios have all been running the studios for 35 plus years. Let's call it almost 40 years now, probably. And the big producers that are producing the big movies, like my boss and my old boss and my old company, there's about 6 or 7 of those guys, and those guys have been in that position of power for 35 or 40 years in Hollywood. They're also not letting go. But the business has changed, the economics have changed, and so the way that I looked at it is I go, listen, my company is built for the next generation of producers. It's the what I like to call like when I was at Atlas, I like to call like myself like Chuck Roven's number two, right? Like I was the guy that was doing all the heavy lifting. I was interfacing with the studios. I was there on set every day. I was physically responsible for delivering the movies. I wasn't collecting the big checks and I wasn't getting all the credit, but I was the guy doing all the work. There's guys like me at every company in town. And so the idea of Big Swell was if we all come together and we all sort of decide like, okay, we're all going to now join together and join forces. And that's going to create a situation where financiers, investors who want to invest in movies, and studios now could essentially come directly to the source. So instead of paying
Ah.
an exorbitant fee that is, quite frankly, like crazy because you're not actually getting that person producing the movie, you're getting their number two. Why not go straight to the number two, pay them what's going to end up being probably 50% of the price, and not deal with any of the headache that comes along with some of these older guys that are now, like I said, in like their late 60s, early 70s, and they're still not letting go. It's a tool I think the business needs. And I think it's, if you look at, what kind of happened this year, I think in the box office with a lot of these like big bloated movies losing money, and not like losing money, but like losing like hundreds of millions of dollars, some of them. The reason for that, in my opinion, is that they're operating on an antiquated idea of how big movies are supposed to be made, because they're being made by people that have been making them for 35 or 40 years under a very specific formulaic model that doesn't make sense anymore for what the economics of Hollywood actually is. And so you have a movie that's being made for $250 million dollars that probably should be made for $150 million dollars, but because the people that are making them don't know how to really do that, you're getting the situation where now you need to make, if you're making a movie for 200 million or 250 million and your movie doesn't gross $1 billion, it's a failure. That's crazy. That shouldn't be a
Mm.
thing. And
Yeah.
so Big Swell, again, it's like our model is to be responsible filmmakers that is not making the movie for more than it should cost, because then you're actually going to be able to make money on your movie when it comes out. Your investors will make their money back. You're not going to be in the situation. And so my goal with Big Swell right now, there's 3 of us. My goal, my 5 year plan is for there to be 10 of us at the end of 5 years. And again, if there's 10 of us that are all coming together, that means that we can make 10 movies a year. And then there's no company in town that's doing what we're doing. Every producer in town has their own company and they're their own sort of figurehead at their own company. But for us, the way that I run Big Swell is that the people that I'm bringing into Big Swell are people like myself that don't need a boss telling them what they can and can't do every day, because they know the right decisions. They know the right people to be in business with. They know how to make movies. They don't need someone micromanaging them and everything that they do. They know the economics and how it works. They should be able to close their own deals. They've delivered movies before. So it's essentially a way for everyone to it's a strength in numbers type of company, where if there's 10 of us, we should be getting calls from every studio. We should be having to turn movies down because there's so many people that want us to produce their movies, because we are that generation that's going to now start taking over. And so that really is kind of the 5 year goal, is for there to be 10 of us. And then and we're making things of all shapes and sizes. So we've got small independent movies, I've got mid-sized movies, and I've got the big studio temple movies. We're doing documentaries and doc series, and so the idea is that also for it to be a one-stop shop. Like for example, I have a division that does doc series and documentaries, and the reason that we're doing those is because we're looking for stories that we feel like are going to work well as a scripted film or a television series, but maybe that it's a challenging story. And so if we make it as a documentary or a doc series, and then we release that and it becomes successful, and then now there's awareness for the story and the character, there's some value in the IP, and now we can parlay that success right into a bigger, much more expensive scripted version. And now we get to be a part of both versions, which means we're now making twice as much money. And so that's also like part of what we're doing in our unscripted division as well, is looking for stories and developing stories and making things that we feel like are going to eventually make a good scripted version. So everything that we do is kind of tailor made towards servicing that scripted film agenda. Sometimes television. We haven't done scripted television yet, but eventually we will when we can hire a TV exec.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So, I mean, it sounds like you're really disrupting, or you will be disruptive to the industry, and that,
yeah,
the old school way is you have to essentially pay kind of a brand fee to get in with one of these big producers, and the people that actually do the work at that big producer aren't necessarily the brand that you paid for, which ends up causing the movie to be too expensive or more expensive than it should be to make.
Yeah.
And there's a better way of doing it, like Big Swell.
That's really it. I mean, honestly, that's like that's the best way to describe it, I think, in its most basic form. And I think, so far we've had a lot of success in terms of people getting very excited about like, oh, now there's a way for us to essentially have the same heavy lifting and the same work that was being done, but costs us half the price as a studio, and it'll allow us to, not have to deal with a lot of the headaches. Sometimes those, older guys are challenging to deal with. They don't necessarily need the money, and so it's it's a new thing that I think is slowly but surely, it's obviously going to be disruptive because that old guard is not going to necessarily love what we're doing, but at the end of the day, it's necessary for the business today, I think, and especially to be successful as a producer. This is really what needs to be done, because the way in which those bigger producers that have been around for a long time run their companies is they don't even have to self-finance their own companies. The studios have what they call first look deals and overhead deals with those producers. So they're giving them, $2 or $3 million a year just to physically run their company. The reason that there haven't been a lot of people doing what I'm doing, which is sort of like the number twos running off and doing it on their own, is because we physically can't afford to do it. The studios aren't giving us that overhead money because they're giving their buddies that overhead money, because these are the same people that have all been connected for 40 years within the business. And so those are the guys that are soaking up all the overhead deals at the studios. And it's why you haven't seen a younger generation guy break off from one of those companies and do it themselves, because we as producers don't get paid until we're making a movie. And so if you're going to break off from one of those bigger companies, try to go do it yourself, you have to be financially in a position where you could potentially not make a single dollar for maybe 2 years. No one's in that position. We've all become sort of addicted to salaries. And I sort of think that was kind of by design, as they've sort of kept us in this position where, like, if you would have ever paid any of those people appropriately in terms of what they're doing, which would have been multiple 7-figure amounts, we would have left. Like, why would we still work for somebody if we're getting paid that kind of money? We're going to leave. So no one gets paid that kind of money. They get stuck there. The studios aren't giving the younger generation overhead deals or studio deals, which is why I had to go out and raise some money, and I was like, okay, if I go raise some money, now I'm just going to go out there and do it on my own. I have investors in the company. It allows us to have those things that those bigger producers have in terms of health insurance and expense account, salaries, all of those things. But I'm not relying on a studio giving me that money. I did it on my own. And so
nice.
It's really a proof of concept. And now that I've got, when there's going to be 5 of us and continue to add to the ranks, eventually I'm sure a studio will approach us to try to do that. And then we'll have to make a decision if we want to end up taking that money or not, or just continue to stay independently. So we'll see. But we're, like I said, we're just like 1 year in so far. Yeah. And most of our first year was kind of beat up by the strikes.
Well, yeah, that's unfortunate. But look, who am I, right? My opinion doesn't matter. But if history is any guide, I think that most industries that are sort of have the like sort of good old boy, old school, things are like they are because this is the way they've always been done, typically find themselves disrupted by innovators like you. And it sounds to me like you figured out the model and had the cojones to go out there and put it together and make it work. So I can't wait to watch you guys rock and roll and
I'm excited too. And by the way, my old boss, Chuck Roven, he's very much in my corner. He's not, even though I consider him like part of that old guard, like he's, him and I have such a great relationship still. And we still talk all the time. We've got projects we're working on together. So he's very supportive of it, and he's been a great champion to just to have in the corner too. It's been nice.
That's awesome. He obviously does,
Yeah.
knows what he's doing and does something right, given
Yeah, he does.
y'all's success together. Just last question, and then I'll let you go. So imagine for a minute that you've got a microphone and that will get this out to the Hollywood community, and you have a chance to talk to the other producers out there, or the old school, the new school. Is there a message or a thought or, anything that you want to make sure that you can shout from the rooftops or tell the industry?
I mean, I would say I would prefer to speak to sort of like the up and coming industry. I think people that are kind of just getting started, or maybe people that are just coming out of film school and just entering the business. Um, this is a business that is extreme highs followed by extreme lows. And I like to equate it to essentially being on a roller coaster. It's like this: you're going up and down and up and down. And it's a very, very emotionally exhausting business, meaning that you will have days where you're having extreme highs and you are just feeling so good about it and things are going great. And then you will have days where you're in extreme lows. You feel like nothing's going right and everything's falling apart and your movies aren't happening. And the people that are successful in this business are the ones that understand that they're on that roller coaster, that they're going to be, when they're in that very high moment and things are going amazing, to remind themselves that it's not going to be like this forever. It's eventually I'm going to be back down in that place soon where I'm hating this business and I'm cursing it. And then when you're down in that place, reminding yourself that eventually I will be back up at that place because I've been there before and I know what it's like. And that every single person in this business is on that roller coaster, from like the PA or the assistant that's just entering the business to Steven Spielberg and Chris Nolan. Those are people that also have those same days all the time where they feel like nothing's going right and this is too hard and I don't want to do this anymore. And so just knowing that, like, at every level of this business, we're all on the same roller coaster ride and we just have to hold on tight. But as a producer, it is consistently pushing a boulder up a hill and the boulder rolling back down on you, and you're just continually pushing it up, and then it comes down a little bit and you're trying to get it up and you're trying to get to that top of the hill. But in reality, there is no top of that hill. As a producer, you're just constantly pushing your whole entire career. You're just going to constantly be pushing it up there. And so you have to really love movies and just love this business to do it. This is a business that, like, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, is what we say all the time. You're never going to get success quickly. It's going to take a lot of time and it's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of tears and a lot of money and a lot of all those things. But if you keep pushing and you eventually just don't let go and you just hold on tight for that roller coaster, it's, in my opinion, like the most rewarding business in the world. There's nothing better than working hard on a movie and then sneaking into the back of a movie theater and sitting there and watching a full theater of people watch what you just spent all those years on. It's an incredible feeling. And also Hollywood too, I think, is, we have a lot of influence on the world in terms of the stories that we tell. And if there are people out there that have important stories that they want to make, or if there are investors that really are interested in getting into Hollywood because they want to tell certain stories, Hollywood is actually a very good tool to influence culture and shape minds and do those things. If you do it smartly, you do it subtly, where it doesn't feel like you're being preached to in a movie, and there's a way to do that where you can actually influence a lot of people. And we have a big responsibility. Hollywood has a big responsibility on its shoulders to make sure that if you have that kind of power, that you're wielding it the right way and that you're saying the right things and preaching the right messages and being responsible with that power. So, I think the next generation of producers and filmmakers have it's going to be challenging for sure. This business is getting harder and harder. It's not getting easier and easier. And just to remember those things as you enter it, that it's a roller coaster ride and it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Damn, Andy, that is unbelievably insightful.
Yeah.
It is big responsibility. Okay, final question I ask every guest. It's a little bit of an off topic.
Yeah.
But all right, so God willing, this will never happen. But your studio or your office catches on fire.
Uh-huh.
And you have a chance to, everybody's safe, all pets, people are safe. You've got a chance, to run back in and grab one thing before, it's completely engulfed. What do you grab?
I feel like these days I grab my laptop because it's got everything, right? It's got all my photos. It's got all my important documents. It's kind of got all the good. It's got all the goods on there. I think these days everything's digitized, right? And so like, I don't necessarily have photo albums anymore and like things like that. And so I would say I'd probably grab the laptop. I mean, if it was, you obviously said your dogs are safe, but for me, my dog's first before anything else. I got 4 dogs.
Love it.
And they get out first, and then I go in for the laptop and say kind of everything else is replaceable, but the things on that probably aren't. Yeah.
It's almost verbatim my same answer. So
yeah,
I love it. Well, Andy, man, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And so this will come out. There's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everything, and then it takes a little while to get as you know better than anybody. It takes a while to get edited, worked up. But Leo and crew, we'll make sure to send you the link. Once it's ready, you'll be the first to know.
Yeah, and I'll spread the word. I'll send it around. Man. Yeah.
Enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Don't forget, everybody, you can find Boundary Breakers in a lot of places. You can watch our episodes on the Boundary Breakers YouTube channel, or you can listen to each podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other major podcasting platforms. Thanks for listening.